NATO is looking at a fiscally constrained environment where we're trying to develop additional capabilities while many European countries have budget cutbacks. Last year, only 4 NATO nations were able to meet their 2% suggested contribution. So my question to the panel is, how do you develop capabilities that will help to meet some of the emerging threats that are facing NATO, especially when a lot of the defense spending that's going on with the NATO nations is primarily on personnel, including pensions and healthcare, rather than buying deployable equipment. So with that, I'll turn it over to the panel, and thank you for having us.
In light of the developments we see on television, southern and northern Syria at the moment, are frightening they are, troubling they are, does what you call ISIL or ISIS, and we have now come to call Islamic State, does this group pose a threat big enough for NATO to act as NATO?
ISIL and other violent extremist groups pose a dramatic and increasing threat to the security of our nations, both in terms of the actual conflict and its potential to spill over, and Turkey is on the front lines in that regard, but also this increasingly dangerous phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters who are going off from our own countries to fight with ISIL. I think our vital security interests are engaged in the fight against ISIL, and the question is, how do we best address the threat? Right now, we're seeing it being done through a coalition led by the United States, but one in which many members of NATO are signing up. The first and foremost responsibility of NATO is to defend its own members, and I think there we took very significant decisions, both the Readiness Action Plan, which will enable us to much more rapidly come to the defense of allies, especially in the East, if they're threatened, through a very high readiness joint task force, the so-called spearhead force, through prepositioning of equipment, forward deployment of command and control, so that there should be no doubt that anyone who threatens NATO will meet a very swift and decisive response. First and foremost, neighboring states to Russia, whose sovereignty, territorial integrity is under direct assault, as President Putin has thrown away the international rule book and is seeking to reestablish hegemony, reestablish a sphere of influence in his neighborhood. We also took a very important commitment, first time ever done at the very high level of heads of state and government, which was to increase defense spending and to increase the percentage of defense spending.
Rhetorically.
Well, as I said, we have to deliver. When it's heads of state and government, it's not just bureaucrats whose credibility is on the line, but it's the heads of state and government. And they gave themselves a decade to move toward the famous 2% of GDP goal, but also to meet the 20% of defense budgets being devoted to actual modernization and equipment, which goes to the question about personnel.
We know that military can strike 24/7 everywhere. We can do this, we NATO. Not all allies, but we as NATO. But we also learned that strike alone doesn't help. It helps for the first time for relieving people in desperate need or whatever. But then you need those second and third legs, or let's take the example of a stool, a hawker stool. 3 legs. Military, you need political will or political structures, rule of law, parliament, democratic procedures, stable government or viable governments. And thirdly, the third leg is economic development. If we can provide this, then I promise you, and we have seen examples, then we can win the peace. So my experience is, let's do it together. We call it comprehensive approach, whatever you do. Military alone doesn't help. Okay, Afghanistan. Well, first of all, you cannot compare any Central Asian state with a European. Well, you can, but there are differences, and we have to acknowledge them. Secondly, you cannot compare Berlin with Kabul in terms of economic power. There is a difference. But you can look into Afghanistan. The economic development is little but positive. They have 3% growth in economic development every year. It is little. According to the ranking, I think they are on rank number 174 or so. And Germany is much higher in the ranking. So it is difficult to compare. But I would say there is the possibility, although there are still some incidents, there is the potential for a stable development with a political viable government, with security forces and little economic incentives. Well, I'm not too pessimistic.
First, I would like to mention something concerning the bottlenecks we have in the German Bundeswehr at the moment. As General Domröse said, it's mainly air transportation and also helicopters. Both was ordered several years ago. Both was expected to be in the Bundeswehr since several years. I think A400M is delayed about 4 years. And NH90 helicopter is delayed about 6 years, something like that. We hope to have the first A400M in November this year, but I'm a member of the Defense Committee and I didn't get an invitation yet for a rollout in November of that plane. Therefore, I'm not sure that probably although this date might be postponed. I think that Putin is acting not on a strategic plan, which includes to take over all former Soviet Union regions. I think he is always doing that what it might opportune at that moment for him, and we should hinder him that he might have new ideas to do. But in general, I think we always need a review on what is the challenge for the Bundeswehr and for Germany, and maybe next year we have to do such a review. But at the moment, I think we are not really in danger by the behavior of the Russian government, as Germany and as NATO, European NATO members.